The primary purpose of Uniquely Human, the podcast, is to educate and inform. The views expressed during all episodes are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute educational or medical advice. Listeners should consult with professionals familiar with each individual or family for specific guidance.
Uniquely Human, the podcast, is produced by Elevated Studio. Music is graciously provided by Matt Savage of Savage Records.
Hi, I'm Dr. Barry Prezant, clinical scholar, researcher, and consultant on autism and neurodiversity, and a Brooklyn boy raised in the big city.
And I'm Dave. I'm none of those things, and I grew up on a farm in Illinois. But being on the spectrum myself, I have plenty of personal insight to lend.
And this is Uniquely Human, the podcast, a show that illuminates and celebrates autism and neurodiversity. Today on Uniquely Human, the podcast, we are so thrilled to have back Gyasi Burks-Abbott. And he was a previous guest on the podcast before, talking about his wonderful book called My Mother's Apprentice and Autistic's Rites of Passage. But we're going to be talking about some other issues today, very important issues. So Gyasi, welcome again to Uniquely Human, the podcast. Great to have you on.
Thanks for inviting me back.
Absolutely. So a little bit of background. Gyasi is on the faculty of LEND, Leadership Education in Neurodevelopmental and Related Disabilities, and that's a program at Boston Children's Hospital and UMass Boston's Institute for Community Inclusion. He serves on the boards, committees, and commissions of many autism and disability organizations, and he's written for several autism and disability-related publications. Gyasi graduated from Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota, and we were just talking about it's pretty cold up there, but it's cold in Boston as well, and has a BA in English and Psychology and an MS, Master's in Science in Library and Information Science from Simmons University in Boston. Gyasi tells the story of how he became an autism self-advocate in his autobiography and memoir titled My Mother's Apprentice and Autistic's Rites of Passage, and I would really encourage our listeners to read it. It's a wonderful book. So let's begin again. Maybe for our listeners who did not hear you on the last podcast that we had you on, share a little bit about your personal story and your journey.
Okay. Well, the last time I was in a podcast, I think I was about to turn 50. Now I'll be 52 in May, and I'm a relatively late diagnosed autistic, not by today's standards, but I was diagnosed at 17, right before my 18th birthday, so 1991. And that was after going through several misdiagnoses. Like I was in special education for a bit, and I was in regular classes. It was thought that I had a learning disability. When I was 11, I was diagnosed with autism residual state. My definitive diagnosis sort of coincided with an understanding in the United States of an autism spectrum. That's when Hans Asperger's work and Leo Kanner's work was published in the same anthology made available in the United States. Mm-hmm. So since that time, I've, as a psych major, as you mentioned in my bio, I did research on autism, which led to me getting involved with autism organizations. And I've done that, and I started getting involved with autism organizations, and I basically have. Well, I did have a job. I'm also a librarian from Simmons, as you mentioned, and I did have a job as a library assistant, but that led to a great deal of stress. I had a lot of problems on that job. There was some misunderstandings, and there was some conflict, so I wound up taking time off and going on disability, and still doing volunteer work with autism organizations and other civic organizations in my town. I live in Bedford. And my mom was an academic, and she was in the humanities, and she got interested in disability studies. So she dipped her toe into the social sciences, and she interviewed me and about my autism, and that she wrote a paper about that for a class she was taking. That led to an article that was published in an anthology of other academics writing about their experience with disabilities called
Mhm.
Felicity Academy. And my mom and I are going to write a book together. We started presenting together around the country. And
Huh.
people always like that dynamic of the self-advocate and the parent of a self-advocate. So my
Hmm.
mom and I were going to continue that and write that as a book. But unfortunately, she was diagnosed with lung cancer and she didn't make it past 6 months. So I basically continued that legacy and finished the book. But what that led to was me being introduced to the LEN program by people who rallied around me when my mom was no longer in the picture. And some
Hmm.
of my colleagues in autism organizations, one of them was an LEND alumni, and she told me about the LEND program. They're looking for a self-advocate. So I got involved with the LEND program, which led to another fellowship at a sister institution. And then I was invited on the faculty. But the LEND program opened up a sort of a developmental disabilities network and led to associations with different projects and presentations having to do with disability. And there's been a change where it's like a lot of the stuff that I used to do for volunteer work, I'm actually now paid for a little bit because my expertise is considered, or my lived experience is considered expertise. So
Yes.
I do some consulting work. So I've been involved with particularly like certain projects of like people, medical schools wanting to improve how they train doctors to deal with people with neurodevelopmental disabilities.
That's
And that
a
research
big,
project.
important issue. Yes. Yeah. So it's just amazing how you kind of entered the journey with your mom. And then, as you said, in your words, you carried on the legacy, and that's so important. So the two issues that I thought would be perfect for us to talk about, because there are important hot issues in discussions around autism and supporting people who are neurodivergent. But it's also areas that you have expertise in and that you've written about. And that is number one, presuming competence. And second point is interdependence. And they are clearly interrelated, but I think it would be easier for us and our listeners to begin by focusing on them individually, and then maybe we could come full circle and talk about how they might be interrelated. So, simple question. What does presuming competence mean to you?
I guess what it means to me is assuming that I am capable of learning. Not that necessarily I already know how to do things, but that I can be taught how to do things, and that it's worth the effort to teach me, even if I don't seem to get it the first time.
Yes. And what, in your experience, as well as other people's experience that you know of, are the benefits to presuming competence, to understanding that people are capable of learning and growing?
I would say it's a more optimistic outlook. In other words, not only does it give the person a certain degree of dignity to assume the best and not assume to worse, but also, it's easier to solve problems when you come to it with a positive attitude. I almost liken it to having a growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset. In other words,
Yes.
okay, you presume competence, maybe you run into some obstacles, maybe the person can't do it what exactly you thought they could do, or maybe not in the way you thought they could do it, but maybe there's an alternative way of doing something.
Hmm.
And so
And,
it's easy to think outside the box and find another way, engage in a kind of lateral thinking.
yes. And I think there's a relationship piece to this as well. I recall, I think it was in 2017 at the Autism Society of America conference. I was privileged and asked to moderate an opening panel with 6 autistic individuals, and the topic was quality of life. And
Mm.
every person on the panel spoke about a person in their life, in many cases it was their mothers, who believed in them, who assumed they can grow and learn, and having that hopeful perspective rather than a limiting perspective. So, do you believe that that holds for the full range of ages and abilities in individuals? I think some people say, well, if we already see some emerging abilities. For example, in language, we know we can kind of go from there, but what about those people who are showing more challenges or limitations in certain areas?
I would say it works for them too. In fact, maybe most especially for them, that you need to approach them with a positive attitude that we can do this, we can find a way. We can, and and maybe, independence for them might look different. In other words, they may not be, they may need let's say, a different type of assistive technology or an augmentative alternative communication. They may
Yes.
need to have assistance in different ways, but it doesn't mean they can't have fulfilling lives and even be somewhat independent.
It's interesting because I think, I'm a speech language pathologist by training, and I think people make assumptions about a person's competence in our culture, especially about how well they speak, how much they speak. We confound speaking ability with intelligence. And I think you're absolutely right. I think maybe especially for people who have more limited abilities, and I'll toss in there more limited abilities in communicating through speech, then very often the assumption is this person is not competent. And they become even a much more a marginalized group within, unfortunately, a larger marginalized group. So there is some pushback against the notion of presuming competence. And so I'm going to quote from an article that was published in 2015 that I think of as an anti-presuming competence argument. And this is by a person named Jason Travers. And he said some of the current thought and rhetoric in the field of special education and disability studies impinges upon these opportunities. And he's talking about opportunities for people with disabilities by approaching the education of children with autism and other developmental disabilities from a philosophical standpoint based on presumption rather than evidence, hope rather than data, and pseudoscience rather than science. What is your feeling about that quote?
Well, it makes me think that the presumption, in terms of, like, if you want to use the frame of evidence-based, well, you gather evidence by starting with an hypothesis, and presuming competence is an hypothesis. My hypothesis is that this person is competent. So that means I'm going to go test my hypothesis. But if my hypothesis was that they weren't competent, I wouldn't test it. So I need to have a hypothesis that this person is competent. So I could start gathering the evidence, and maybe I'll find that they can't do what I thought they can do, or maybe they can't do it in the way I thought they could do it, but then there's always a possibility of accommodations or finding other ways of doing things. So
Gets back to the point of what additional supports do we have to put in place so that we can realize the full potential of the individual. That it's not that, okay, well, the limitation is in the person, going back to the social model of disability. What supports can we put into place so that person can be realized and take full advantage of appropriate opportunities? I want to throw in one other point. This goes way, way back to my mentor in my master's program. He published an article years ago. His name was John Muma. And he published an article that data is not evidence. So I could go back and say, yeah, there's published peer-reviewed data that says you could stop stimming, okay, in people, or you could suppress echolalia in people, and that you can get people to be passive and compliant and jump when you say jump and touch nose when you say touch nose and so forth. But is that evidence of improving quality of life, improving self-determination? I think we have to understand that just arguing data stops at a certain point, and we have to say, well, what is that evidence of, even if you could demonstrate the data in your intervention has worked?
I like that, because the data is not just going to sit by itself. It has to be interpreted, and it's all like, I like what you point out in Uniquely Human about delayed echolalia. It's about how, for instance, it's not meaningless utterances. The people you document actually have a particular meaning behind their phrases, and to me, it strikes me very much as idiomatic expressions, like hit the ball out of the park. We
Yes.
say that when someone does a great job, not because they're watching a baseball game. So, like when you give the example of the kid who said, no dogs, dogs bite, and that was his way of indicating it's safe. It's like, well, isn't that his own idiomatic expression? So it's a framing. So it's like, is the person really not competent, or are they just not competent in the way that you value? Like I always think in my own case of the friend I had when I was in college, who would be considered more impacted by autism than me. He
Mhm.
spoke with a monotone voice. He always, whenever he called me, he would give his full name, and he also was somewhat of a literal thinker. We were seeing a movie together, a very, very explicit movie. It was a Quentin Tarantino. It was just came out in theaters, and it's very explicit, very violent. Nothing left to the imagination.
Mhm.
Except there was a scene that I had to explain to my friend. But, before I could say that I was the high functioning one, bringing the light to my lower functioning brethren, I had to remember that I wouldn't have been at that theater if he hadn't driven me. And he'd been driving since he was 16. Still don't know how to drive.
Ah,
And so it's like, who's competent in that situation? Me explaining to him what the scene means, or him the fact that he was able to drive me there? I mean,
that's. Is he still driving you around? I hope so.
no, no, no. I haven't seen him in 30 years. So.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting when we talk about abilities, because another argument against presuming competence is that, well, if we overestimate abilities, we're not approaching a person at the level that they're capable of learning. What do you think about that?
Well, that's interesting because the way you usually learn is to be taken out of your comfort zone.
Yes.
I mean, to have someone present something to you that's just above what you're able to do at this moment, but you're supposed to reach for it. I mean, it shouldn't be too much, it shouldn't be overwhelming, but in essence, to expose someone to something that they may not be ready for, they could become ready for it. I mean, I could think of many things that I was exposed to that really didn't click, maybe for a few years.
Yes.
Like it's because it's just the time wasn't right. I mean, I find out especially with all the policy I'm studying. I mean, some of the policy I'm studying, I'm looking at systems that basically have been a part of my life from the beginning, but I'm only in a way just beginning to really understand how they work and their dynamics. But
Yes.
I've been exposed to them, of course.
Sometimes things need to sit with us for a while. And, I know I hold on to concepts that I say, I don't quite get it yet. But in experience, as you just said, then it comes and almost you grow into that understanding. And that's, again, something that I've heard so much, even from non-speaking people on the spectrum who I know, talking about being able to be immersed in learning environments and taking in the information, rather than that being restricted because people believe, oh, well, she's not able to understand that, so why do we even talk about that with her? Or should we talk to this non-speaking person as if they are a preschooler, even though they might be a older child or teenager and an adult? So I think that's a very, very important argument. We grow into learning, and as long as we're not seeing, at least my opinion, that we're causing a great deal of dysregulation or the person is getting very, very upset, those should be signals that, okay, maybe it's too much too quickly. But other than that, you talk about opportunities to learn. How can a person have an opportunity to learn unless they're immersed in whatever it might be, activities, information that helps them grow into that? So important.
And I guess it has to be done in a positive way so that they don't feel bad about the fact that maybe they're not quite getting it immediately.
Yes, absolutely.
That's an obsession.
No, that's an enthusiasm. That's my jam. That's my jam. One thing just I can do, part of who I
Hello, this is Noah with your enthusiasm of the day. This enthusiasm comes from Isaac in Illinois, who says, I love bacteria. As a child and teenager, I shied away from my deep love of science and categorization in search of something more normative. Well, now I'm a doctoral student studying microbial ecology, and this type of intense focus is not only okay, it's celebrated. Graduate school and autism brings plenty of its own challenges, but not being allowed to talk about bacteria all day is certainly not one of them. I am so glad to hear about your love for bacteria, Isaac. It is true that bacteria really makes the world go around, as I'm sure you know, and now that you've devoted your studies to learning more about it and teaching people about it, I think that's an amazing use of your enthusiasm. So that's a great lesson for all of us, that if we follow our interests and our enthusiasms, they could end up taking us to awesome places, like maybe even graduate school. So thank you so much for sharing, Isaac. Back to you, Barry and Dave.
Just curious, I know a lot of your advocacy work also has to do with the work environment and job opportunities. So I think, maybe some of our listeners think our discussion has been focused on school age. But how do you think presuming competence applies, especially in work settings and beyond the school years?
I think that comes up particularly with how people get jobs, or how the job process works. Because I would almost say there's like an ideal candidate, perfect employee paradox, where it's like, people with disabilities can bring a lot to the workplace, and people with all types of disabilities. I mean, as the author Tiffany Yu in her book The Anti-Ableist Manifesto points out, people with disabilities are the ultimate life hackers. And of course there are other reasons why people with disabilities can bring a lot of good to the workplace. And it improves company culture because people feel like they can have psychological safety, so they can ask questions. It ask for help when they need, even if they're not disabled. It improves. Of course, there are also financial incentives, but also statistics show that disabled employers are usually, you know there's better retention, less turnover, and also companies do make more. And so in essence, in terms of presuming competence, usually, sometimes companies fear that hiring a person with a disability will cost a lot of money in terms of accommodations. And usually the accommodations aren't that usually are not, they're free. Basically, it just might be an alteration. Something as simple as allowing someone to work from home, which is interesting. During the pandemic, that became everyone was working from home. But that's an accommodation, flexible work schedule. So in other words,
Can,
not necessarily doing things always in the same way. Yeah.
or changing the sensory environment, or allowing more breaks as needed, which can benefit everybody who work in very intensive and kind of sedentary requirements for working. Yeah, I mean it's really amazing when we think about allowing people to grow with the right supports, as opposed to you need to prove your abilities from the get-go for us to even hire you. And the last point you made, I think, or one of the last points you made, is so important. And this is evidence-based, that when we see diversity in work environments, we see just a much, much more positive atmosphere and greater productivity than when we limit that. And unfortunately, given our current circumstances politically, we're going to have to fight to retain as much of that as possible. So important. So, okay, so let's shift, if you will, to the other concept, and that is interdependence. So, Gyasi, I'm going to toss it at your way again. And what does interdependence mean to you? Certainly a term that we've heard quite a bit in recent years.
I think it's something very, very basic. The fact that no one can do everything by themselves. And that, I mean, it's interesting, having a disability, the goal is to be independent. Um, but I mean, that's not a wrong goal. Maybe it can be better stated because it's more like part of being independent is knowing your limits and knowing what you can and cannot do and knowing where to ask for help, how to get help, who to ask for help. I mean, independence is like making that phone call you have to make to ask for assistance, to make that doctor's appointment. That's independence. Even though
Yes.
you're not the doctor, but you're making a phone call makes you independent. So I mean that's a corny example, but what I'm saying is recognizing your limits, and there's nothing wrong with having them. I mean, it's like going back to assistive technology or accommodations. I mean, I remember the time when assistive technology was normalized for me. I was at a conference, and a person with physical disabilities asked a question. She said, "Has anyone used an elevator lately?" And of course, we all had just come down from our hotel rooms in an elevator. So we said, "Yeah, we used an elevator just now." And she said, "Congratulations, you use assistive technology." And got me thinking, yeah, that makes sense because we all need technology to assist us in one way or another, So, whether it's a car, whether it's a day timer, we all need or a computer assistance with organizing our time, remembering things, communicating remotely, stuff like that. So, and that should be normal. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. Usually we don't think anything of it. I mean, I even think the distinction between hearing aids and glasses. I mean, both are to correct a sensory impairment, but one's very distinctly a disability, assistive
Hmm.
technology, and the other is not. So it is very interesting. I don't know how that decision got made, but in other words, some technologies are strange and some aren't.
I think about even word prediction on a computer.
Yes.
It's kind of like there we have technology helping us to have to think or at least plan our motor skills less because we could just hit one key and
Yeah.
that multisyllabic word is plugged in because we knew the first three letters when we typed it. Um, but the whole notion of interdependence also, on the relationship level, kind of, going back to what I mentioned, that panel that I was privileged to moderate, how many, actually all six panelists identified people in their lives that presumed competence, that believed in them, and that had that relationship of, on so many levels, helping a person to regulate when they needed that support and being emotionally well regulated, helping that person to problem solve and work through a cognitive issue as well. Um, and the notion of independence, once again, I think, has been elevated to such a level of prominence. Well, if he can't type on that keyboard totally independently, then we don't believe it's that person truly authoring the message. That's how we teach people. That's how we interact with people. As I'm asking you a question now, thinking about your background. I'm not going to ask you a question about experience in race car driving. I'm going to ask you about your experience and your expertise in advocacy. So this interdependence piece always has to do with the relationship. So I'm just curious, are you familiar with work situations, or maybe your work situation, where interdependence is supported well and even celebrated? In other words, people working closely together to achieve desired outcomes.
I would say definitely because, well, I mean, part of the LEND program is that it's interdisciplinary. And the idea is that, the way we're approaching policy or understanding of disability or anything is from different vantage points that all come together to make it make sense. Or even like when we, in some of the other, let's say, committees I sit on, for instance, like if we go to the State House to, for instance, hand out flyers for an upcoming event to our legislators, we go in a group and we have to sort of split up and take different, you take this side of the building, I'll take this side of the building. And basically, we're sort of always doing things. I mean, we work independently. A lot of us work from home. Some of us work in the office, but we also are interdependent. We have to do things together. We can't. We rely on each other, and you know.
And I really like what you said previously, that kind of twists the argument on its head a little bit, that to be successfully independent, you have to know, okay, well, I've kind of reached my limits of capability, expertise. It could be your motor skills. And okay, I know where that boundary is, but now it's time to get that support. And I know, well, from many interviews on this podcast, many neurodivergent guests have said that they learned much later than they wish they had learned that they can ask for help, that they can reach out to others. Even the concept that another person can be helpful to me in this problem-solving activity, whatever it might be, and helping to cook eggs in the morning. That's such an important skill. Do you see that as something that really needs to be prioritized, especially starting with kids and then moving up into the adult years?
Because in essence, we need to kind of normalize it, because in many ways we do normalize. We do normalize asking for help, but there's some instances where we don't. We kind of do think we have to do this all on our own, or it doesn't count. And we almost have to remind ourselves that actually, no, it still counts if we initiate the help. It's almost like, a leader can't be a leader by themselves. They need to have followers. So, I mean, it's, you need to be able to have people who can support you and help you accomplish your goals. It's, that's just as important.
And in a sense, it's an aspect of being self-determined.
Yeah.
That I can make the decision as to whether I feel competent and can be successful in doing this activity by myself, or whether, having that collaborative support from another person is going to be necessary. So it seems to me that presuming competence and interdependence are somewhat related. They're really not separate issues. So I've thought about this a bit, but I'm really curious as to your thoughts about how these may be related.
They may be related. Well, I guess presuming competence and interdependence can also be kind of internal, where it's like if you presume competence in yourself, you won't have a problem with asking other people for help. You might recognize that as a form of competence. And then people will not externally be bothered by you or look askance at you asking for help. They might recognize that as a sign of leadership or maturity or self-awareness. And you were mentioning the conference you were at where it was adults on the autism spectrum talking about quality of life, and I think about the Surgeon General's advisory on loneliness as being a health threat. So in essence, it's very important to be in relation to other people. So it's very important to not always be by yourself and on your own. And of course, one reason he suggests is that in essence, being around other people can not only you can get help when you need it, but also it could be motivating.
Yes.
It can help you perform better, help you be healthier, because people are around you, they see you, they recognize you, and you can learn from them and they get that.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing up the Surgeon General's comment on that, because it's so important. And we do know that research indicates for older individuals, it is so important to have a social network. And I think for everybody in general, that's a very important kind of support for mental health. That some of the greatest triggers for depression and other mental health issues has to do with being isolated and feeling nobody understands your experience. and feeling that even if I wanted to reach out, nobody's going to help me. So that whole notion of building a person's self-esteem by presuming competence with the right supports, very, very important, and interdependence, that these issues are like hand in glove almost, and we have to consider that. And it is unfortunate that people, unfortunately, too many people are still believing that independence is the promised land and that we should withhold support, even if a person is very challenged, becoming dysregulated in an activity, or we should ignore them if the dysregulation, results in what's considered to be undesirable behavior. Whereas emotional regulation is all about being attuned to another person's feelings and experience and being able to step in. Those terms, co-regulation, that we call mutual regulation.
And it even doesn't just help with the mental health, but physical health too.
Absolutely.
So,
And the interrelationship between mental health and physical health. If you're feeling lousy in terms of your emotional state, it impacts your physiology, and we know that.
Cortisol goes up, your blood pressure goes up, and that leads to a whole bunch of problems. Inflammation, stuff like, especially as you get older.
I can attest to that as you get older.
Yeah,
That's for sure. So, and very important points that you've made. Any other thoughts on these issues? I'm sure they are going to continue to be discussed and even debated in how best to support people, how best to engage in trusting relationships with others. Any other thoughts before we depart?
I guess the only thing goes back to maybe an earlier question you had for me regarding people of all ages and all abilities. And I guess I just would like to stress that, this doesn't only apply to people who, for instance, might be considered higher functioning. This would be apply to anyone, even with people with the most severe disabilities, because they can improve. They could benefit from a positive outlook and a positive attitude, and they could accomplish that. They can accomplish more than you might think they can accomplish with certain accommodations. I mean, what they accomplish might be different than what someone else accomplishes, but that's fine. I mean, it doesn't mean they can't have a great quality of life and even be successful. Yeah.
Thank you. And that's a really interesting point, that maybe quality of life does have to do with how much we presume competence and how much we embrace interdependence. I think lived experience of so many people, many guests that we've had on, and so many people we learn from certainly supports that. So, right. Gyasi, thank you so much. I knew this would be a really terrific discussion. I've learned more, and best of luck to you in your very important work with the LEND program.
No, thank you. Thanks, you too. Luck to you too.
All righty, thanks.
Yeah. Talk to you later.